Alira Whitmore's hand froze on the drawer handle. The paper inside had her name on it, written in ink that was still faintly wet, and a number beside it large enough to buy a house. She had only opened the drawer to find a spare candle. Now she could not look away from the words at the top of the page. A contract. Her name as the subject of it. Her aunt's signature at the bottom, pressed so hard into the paper that it had almost torn through. She heard footsteps on the stairs and shoved the drawer shut, but her fingers were shaking, and the latch did not catch. When her Aunt Margaret Voss walked into the study a moment later, the drawer was still an inch open, and Alira was standing too close to it to explain herself. "What are you doing in here?" Margaret said. It was not really a question. It was the tone she used when she already knew the answer and wanted to watch someone squirm before admitting it. "I was looking for a candle," Alira said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. Margaret's eyes moved to the drawer, then back to her niece's face. For a long moment neither of them spoke. The clock on the wall ticked loud enough to fill the silence between them, each second stretching a little longer than the last. "You should knock before entering rooms that are not yours," Margaret said finally. She crossed the room, closed the drawer herself, and turned the small brass key that locked it. She slipped the key into the pocket of her dress, patted it once, and looked at Alira as if daring her to ask what was inside. Alira did not ask. She had learned a long time ago that questions in this house were rarely answered, only punished. That night, lying in the narrow bed in the room at the top of the stairs, Alira could not stop thinking about the number on that page. She had lived with her aunt since she was 11 years old, since the accident that took her parents on a road outside the village, since the lawyers had decided that a distant aunt was better than an orphanage. For 6 years she had cooked, cleaned, and kept the household ledgers by candlelight because her aunt said electricity was a luxury reserved for people who had earned it. She had never once seen a contract with her own name on it. She had never once seen that much money mentioned in connection with anything in this house. She turned the thought over and over until sleep finally took her, uneasy and shallow, full of half-formed images of locked drawers and numbers she could not make sense of. The next morning, breakfast was quiet in the way that meant something was coming. Margaret ate her toast with small, precise bites, glancing at Alira every few minutes as though checking whether she had grown suspicious overnight. The household's only other resident, an aging butler named Corwin who had worked for the family longer than Alira had been alive, moved around the table refilling cups without meeting anyone's eyes. He had always been kind to her in small, quiet ways, a second helping here, an extra blanket there, but he never spoke against Margaret. Alira understood why. He needed the position as much as she needed a roof over her head. "We have been invited to a dinner on Friday," Margaret said, setting down her cup. "A very important dinner. You will need a new dress." Alira blinked. In 6 years, her aunt had never once offered to buy her anything beyond what was strictly necessary. New shoes came only when the old ones had holes. A new dress, offered freely, was so far outside the pattern of their life together that it felt like a warning rather than a gift. "What kind of dinner?" Alira asked. "The kind where you smile and say very little," Margaret said. "There will be several gentlemen there, important men with important names. You will be polite. You will be charming. You will not embarrass me." Something cold settled into Alira's stomach, the same cold feeling she had carried since the moment she saw her name on that contract. She thought of the number again, the ink still wet, the way her aunt had looked at her like she already knew Alira had seen it. "Aunt Margaret," she said carefully, "is this dinner about the paper I saw yesterday?" Margaret's cup stopped halfway to her lips. For a fraction of a second, something flickered across her face, not guilt exactly, but something close enough that Alira recognized it. Then it was gone, replaced by the same flat, controlled expression her aunt always wore. "You saw nothing," Margaret said. "You will wear the blue dress in the wardrobe upstairs. It has already been altered to fit you. Corwin will fetch it after breakfast." The conversation was over. Elira knew better than to push further, but the cold feeling in her stomach did not go away. It sat there through the rest of the day, through the fitting of the blue dress, through dinner, through the long hours of darkness when she lay awake listening to the house settle around her. 2 days later, in the hush of the afternoon while her aunt was out visiting a neighbor, Elira found herself back in the study. The drawer was still locked, but she had watched her aunt handle that small brass key enough times to know exactly where it lived, in the inner pocket of the gray coat that hung by the front door. Her aunt rarely wore that coat before evening. Her hands trembled as she slid the key into the lock. She told herself she could stop at any moment, that she could still walk away and pretend she had never wondered. But some part of her, the part that had spent 6 years being told what to do and never why, needed to know. The drawer opened. The contract was still there, exactly where she had left it. This time she picked it up and read it properly, every line, every clause, her eyes moving faster and faster as the meaning became clear. It was not a simple business arrangement. It was an agreement between her aunt and a man named Edmund Prescott, a wealthy merchant Elira had met only once, at a market 2 years earlier, when he had looked at her for a moment too long, and said something to her aunt that made Margaret laugh in a way Elira had never heard before. The contract promised that Elira would marry this man before the year was out. In exchange, Margaret would receive the sum written at the top of the page, paid in installments, the first of which had apparently already been transferred, given the date stamped in the corner. Elira read it twice more, as though the words might rearrange themselves into something less terrible the second time. They did not. Her aunt had not been protecting her all these years out of any kind of love. She had been keeping her, feeding her, clothing her, the way a farmer keeps livestock fed until the day it is sold. She heard the front door open downstairs and nearly dropped the paper. She folded it as quickly as she could, slid it back into the drawer, turned the key, and was halfway across the room when her aunt appeared in the doorway, coat still on, cheeks flushed from the cold outside. "You are very pale," Margaret said, studying her niece's face with the sharp attention of someone who noticed everything and forgave nothing. "I have a headache," Elira said. It was almost true. Her temples were pounding. Margaret did not press the matter, but she watched Elira for a long moment before finally removing her coat and hanging it back on its hook. Elira's eyes went briefly to the pocket where the key had been, and for one terrible second she was certain her aunt had noticed the direction of her gaze. But Margaret only turned away and began removing her gloves, one finger at a time, as though nothing in the world was wrong. That night Elira did not sleep at all. She lay on her back staring at the ceiling, running through everything she now understood. Friday's dinner was not an introduction. It was a delivery. Whatever charm and politeness her aunt expected from her at that table was simply the final polish on a transaction that had already been agreed to weeks or months ago, without Elira's knowledge or consent. She thought about running. She had no money, no family beyond her aunt, nowhere in the world that would take her in. She thought about refusing outright, standing up at that dinner table and telling every guest exactly what kind of arrangement had brought her there. But she had seen the way her aunt handled disagreement in this house, the small cruelties, the withheld meals, the long silences that stretched for days as punishment for the smallest defiance. She had no doubt what a public refusal would cost her. By the time the gray light of early morning crept through her window, she had decided on the only thing she could decide. She would go to the dinner. She would smile when she was told to smile. But she would watch everything, and she would wait, because a locked drawer had already taught her that the truth in this house was always hidden somewhere close, if she was patient enough and careful enough to find it. Friday arrived faster than she wanted it to. The blue dress fit perfectly, which only made her feel worse, as though her body had been carefully measured for a sale rather than an evening out. Margaret inspected her from head to toe before they left, adjusting a curl of hair here, straightening a seam there, the same way a merchant might inspect goods before laying them out on display. The carriage ride to the estate where the dinner was being held was silent, except for the rhythmic sound of the horses' hooves on the road. Alira watched the countryside pass by the window, fields turning gold and brown in the last days of autumn, and tried to keep her breathing steady. Whatever waited at the end of this road, she intended to face it with her eyes open, even if no one else in that room knew what she now understood. The house, when they arrived, was larger than anything Alira had seen before, its windows lit gold against the darkening sky, its front steps flanked by stone lions worn smooth by decades of weather. A servant took her cloak at the door. Another led her and her aunt through a hall lined with paintings toward a dining room already filled with the low murmur of conversation. Alira scanned the room as she entered, cataloging faces without meaning to, the habit of 6 years spent reading a room before it could hurt her. She saw Edmund Prescott near the head of the table, dressed in fine dark clothing, his eyes finding her almost the moment she stepped through the door. She saw her aunt's posture straighten, saw the practiced smile settle onto Margaret's face like a mask she had worn 1,000 times before. And then, near the far end of the table, seated slightly apart from the rest of the guests, she saw a man she did not recognize at all. He was not looking at her the way Edmund Prescott was looking at her. He was not looking at her at all. His attention was fixed on a small chip in the porcelain plate in front of him, turning it slightly with 2 fingers, studying it the way someone might study a puzzle they intended to solve before the meal was finished. Alira did not know his name yet. She did not know that within the hour, everything her aunt had planned for that evening would begin to come apart at the seams. She only knew, standing there in the doorway with the weight of a contract she was never meant to see pressing on her chest, that something about the stranger at the end of the table felt different from every other person in the room, and that difference, whatever it was, might be the only thing standing between her and the future her aunt had already sold. The dinner had not yet begun, and already the air in that room felt heavier than any air she had breathed before, thick with unspoken arrangements and eyes that watched her a little too closely. Alira took her seat where her aunt directed her, folded her hands in her lap the way she had been taught, and waited to see what the evening would ask of her next. The soup arrived first, thin and pale, served by a line of quiet servants who moved around the table with practiced precision. Alira lifted her spoon because it was expected of her, not because she had any appetite left. Across the table, Edmund Prescott was talking loudly about a shipment of goods he had recently brought in from the coast, and every few sentences he glanced her way, as though checking that she was still listening, still smiling, still exactly where he wanted her to be. She smiled because her aunt had told her to smile. She said little because there was little she trusted herself to say without her voice betraying what she now knew. But her eyes kept drifting to the far end of the table, to the man who had not yet spoken a single word to anyone, the one still turning that chipped plate slightly under his fingers, as though the flaw in the porcelain was the only interesting thing in the entire room. He was younger than most of the other guests, though not young in the way that suggested he lacked experience. There was something settled about him, something careful, the way he sat slightly back from the table instead of leaning into the conversation the way everyone else did. His clothes were finer than anyone else's at that table, understated in a way that somehow made them more expensive looking rather than less, dark fabric with no unnecessary decoration, as though he had no need to prove anything to the room around him. Alira assumed at first that he was simply another buyer, another man her aunt had invited to look her over, to consider whether the arrangement with Edmund Prescott might be improved upon, or replaced, or bid against. The thought made her stomach turn, but it also made a strange kind of sense. Why else would a stranger of his obvious standing sit at a dinner clearly organized around her future, unless he too had some interest in the outcome? She kept her eyes low after that, refusing to look at him again, refusing to give her aunt any reason to notice her attention wandering toward another prospect. She answered Edmund Prescott's questions with short, polite responses. Yes, she enjoyed reading. No, she had not traveled much. Yes, the soup was very good, though she had barely tasted it. It was not until the second course arrived, a roasted bird surrounded by small vegetables arranged with more care than the meal itself seemed to deserve, that the stranger finally spoke. His voice was quiet, but it carried across the table in the way that quiet voices sometimes do when a room is paying more attention than it appears to be. "This plate has a flaw in it," he said, to no one in particular. "Right here along the rim. A hairline crack, old, probably from the kiln rather than from use. Someone chose to serve on it anyway." The table went briefly silent. Margaret's smile tightened at the corners. The host, a heavy-set man Alira did not know by name, laughed a little too quickly and offered to have the plate replaced, but the stranger waved the offer away with 2 fingers, the same 2 fingers that had been turning the plate all evening. "I only find it interesting," he said, "that in a room full of people trying very hard to appear perfect, no one noticed the imperfection sitting directly in front of them until I pointed it out." Alira felt something tighten in her chest at those words, though she could not have said exactly why. It did not feel like an idle comment about porcelain. It felt like something aimed, carefully and precisely, at the entire arrangement of the evening, though no one else at the table seemed to register it that way. Edmund Prescott laughed along with the others and moved the conversation back to his shipment of goods. Margaret's smile returned to its usual practiced shape. But the stranger's eyes, for just a moment, moved to Alira's face and held there, and she felt the full weight of being truly seen for the first time since she had walked through the door. He did not look at her the way Edmund Prescott looked at her. There was no hunger in it, no calculation of value. It was closer to the way he had looked at the chipped plate, curious, attentive, as though he were trying to work out exactly what had gone wrong and who was responsible for it. She looked away first. She told herself it did not matter what one stranger noticed or did not notice. Nothing about tonight was going to change, because a man at the far end of the table had a talent for spotting flaws in dinnerware. But for the rest of the meal, she found her attention returning to him again and again, cataloging small details the way she had once cataloged the faces in the room. He ate very little. He spoke only when spoken to, and even then his answers were short, giving away almost nothing about himself. He never once looked at Margaret the way the other guests did, with the polite deference people usually showed a woman of her standing. If anything, his glances toward her aunt carried something closer to suspicion. When the meal finally ended and the guests began to move toward the drawing room for coffee and conversation, Alira found herself separated from her aunt for the first time all evening, caught in the slow shuffle of bodies moving from one room to another. She did not know how it happened, only that one moment she was near Margaret's elbow, and the next she was standing beside the stranger from the end of the table, close enough that she could see the careful, deliberate way he held himself, like a man who had trained his body never to give anything away. "You did not eat much," he said. "It was not quite a question." "I was not very hungry," Alira said, which was true enough, though not the whole truth. "Understandable," he said, "given the company." She looked at him sharply then, searching his face for some sign of what he meant, but his expression gave nothing away. He was simply watching her, waiting to see how she would respond, the same way he had watched the crack in the plate. "I do not believe we have been introduced," Alira said carefully, choosing her words the way she chose everything in that house, one careful step at a time, never certain of the ground beneath her. "No," he agreed, "we have not." He did not offer his name. He simply continued walking beside her toward the drawing room, matching his pace to hers, close enough to speak quietly without being overheard by the guests moving around them. "Your aunt has arranged quite an evening," he said. "A great deal of effort for a dinner that on the surface looks like nothing more than a social gathering." Alira's heart began to beat faster. "I am not certain what you mean." "I think you understand exactly what I mean," he said, and there was no cruelty in his voice, only a kind of steady patience, as though he had all the time in the world to wait for her to catch up to a conversation he had already had with himself. "You found something you were not meant to find. I could see it in your face the moment you walked into that room tonight. You have been carrying it all evening like a stone in your shoe." Elira stopped walking. Around them, the other guests continued on toward the drawing room, their voices fading into the distance, leaving the two of them alone in the corridor between rooms, lit only by the flickering light of candles set into the wall. "Who are you?" she asked, and this time it was not a polite formality. She needed to know. "My name is Alden Ashford," he said. "I hold the title of Duke of Camborne, for whatever that is worth to you at this particular moment. And I did not come here tonight because your aunt invited me for the reason she believes I came." Elira's mind raced through everything she had read on that contract, every clause, every number, searching for the name Ashford somewhere among the details, but she found nothing. He was not part of the arrangement she had discovered. He was something else entirely, something she had no way of understanding yet. "Then why did you come?" she asked. Alden glanced back toward the drawing room, where the sound of voices and clinking cups had grown louder, before he answered. "Because your aunt is not the only person in that house with debts she would rather keep hidden, and because Edmund Prescott is not the kind of man whose interests I take lightly, particularly when they involve someone as young as you." "You know him," Elira said. "I know enough about him to know that whatever your aunt believes she has arranged, it is not the simple exchange she thinks it is," Alden said. "Prescott does not pay debts as generously as the number on that contract suggests, not without expecting something far greater in return than a wife." The corridor felt suddenly colder. Elira wrapped her arms around herself, though the chill she felt had little to do with the temperature of the house. "How do you know about the contract?" For the first time since she had met him, something like hesitation crossed Alden's face, quickly hidden but not quickly enough for her to miss it entirely. "That is a longer conversation than we have time for tonight," he said. "Your aunt will notice your absence soon, and I would prefer she did not connect the two of us so early in the evening. But I need you to trust me on one point, even though you have no reason yet to trust a stranger who will not fully explain himself." "What point is that?" Elira asked. "Do not sign anything," Alden said. "Not tonight, not this week, not until you have spoken to me again. Whatever your aunt asks of you, whatever paper she places in front of you and tells you it would be easier to simply agree, do not put your name to any of it." Before Elira could ask another question, the sound of her aunt's voice carried down the corridor, calling her name with the sharp edge that meant she had noticed the absence and was already displeased by it. Alden stepped back, putting a respectable distance between them just as Margaret rounded the corner, her eyes moving quickly between her niece and the Duke with an expression Elira had never seen on her aunt's face before. It was not suspicion, though there was some of that. It was closer to fear, quickly buried beneath the same practiced smile Margaret wore for every occasion, but not quickly enough that Elira did not catch a glimpse of it first. "Your Grace," Margaret said, her voice pitched carefully between warmth and deference, "I did not realize you had already made my niece's acquaintance." "We were simply discussing the flaws in your host's dinnerware," Alden said smoothly, as though the entire previous conversation had never happened. "A fascinating subject, I find. It reveals a great deal about a household, the things it chooses to hide beneath a fine tablecloth." Margaret's smile did not waver, but her eyes went cold in a way Elira recognized from years of living under her roof. It was the look her aunt gave when she suspected she was losing control of a situation and had not yet decided how to take it back. "How amusing," Margaret said. "Come, Elira, the others are waiting for us in the drawing room." Elira allowed herself to be led away, but she looked back once, just before the corridor curved out of sight, and found Alden Ashford watching her go, his expression unreadable. The same careful patience he had shown the chip in the porcelain plate now turned, it seemed, entirely toward her. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of polite conversation Alira barely registered, her mind circling back again and again to the words the Duke had spoken. Do not sign anything. It was such a simple instruction, and yet it felt like the first piece of real guidance anyone had offered her since the moment she found that contract in the locked drawer. She did not know why a stranger with a title and an estate somewhere she had never heard of would concern himself with the fate of a girl he had met only an hour ago. But something in the steadiness of his voice, in the careful way he had chosen his words, told her that whatever game was being played around her, he was not playing it on her aunt's side. When the carriage finally carried them home that night, Margaret sat rigid and silent across from her, staring out the window at the dark countryside with an expression Alira had never seen before, somewhere between calculation and unease. She did not ask what Alira and the Duke had discussed. She did not mention his name at all. But when they arrived home and Margaret climbed the stairs to her room, she paused at the top, one hand resting on the banister, and looked back down at her niece with an expression that carried something almost like a warning. "Stay away from that man," Margaret said. "Whatever he told you tonight, it was not kindness. Men like that do not concern themselves with girls like you unless they want something for themselves." Then she disappeared into her room and closed the door, leaving Alira standing alone in the dark hallway, turning the Duke's words over in her mind, wondering which of the two people in her life, the aunt who had raised her or the stranger who had warned her, was the one actually telling her the truth. 3 days passed without another word from the Duke, and in that silence, Alira began to wonder if she had imagined the entire conversation, if the strain of discovering the contract had made her invent a rescuer out of nothing more than a stranger's polite curiosity about broken porcelain. Her aunt watched her more closely than usual during those days, finding small reasons to keep her occupied: extra mending, extra accounts to balance, extra trips to the market that always seemed to take longer than necessary. Alira understood the pattern well enough by now. Margaret was trying to keep her too busy and too tired to think. It did not work. If anything, the constant activity gave her more time to turn the puzzle over in her mind, piece by piece, while her hands were busy with needle and thread or column after column of numbers. She thought about the way her aunt's smile had gone cold in that corridor. She thought about the warning Margaret had given her at the top of the stairs, and the way it had sounded less like concern for her niece's well-being and more like fear that something was slipping out of her control. On the 4th day, a letter arrived. Corwin brought it to her directly, slipping it into her hand while Margaret was occupied elsewhere in the house, his eyes flicking toward the stairs as though checking they were truly alone. "This came for you," he said quietly. "Not through the front door. A boy brought it round to the kitchen entrance and asked that it be given only to you." Alira's fingers trembled slightly as she took the folded paper. There was no name on the outside, no seal, nothing to indicate who had sent it. But something in the careful, precise handwriting felt familiar even before she opened it, and found the Duke's name signed at the bottom. The letter was short. It asked her to meet him the following afternoon at the small chapel on the eastern edge of the village, a building Alira knew only by reputation, a place mostly abandoned now except for the occasional traveler seeking shelter from the rain. It gave a time, and nothing more, no explanation, no promises, only the same quiet confidence she remembered from their conversation in the corridor. She burned the letter in the kitchen fire that night, watching the paper curl and blacken before it disappeared entirely, the way Corwin had taught her years ago to destroy anything her aunt was not meant to find. Then she lay awake most of the night, weighing the risk of what she was about to do against the growing certainty that she had no better options left. The next afternoon, she told her aunt she needed air, that the walls of the house felt too close and her head ached from the closeness of the rooms. Margaret regarded her with suspicion but eventually allowed it, on the condition that she return before the light began to fade. Alira agreed quickly, perhaps too quickly, and left the house before her aunt could change her mind. The walk to the chapel took the better part of an hour, along roads that grew narrower and quieter the farther she traveled from the village center, until finally the small stone building appeared ahead of her, its roof sagging in places, its windows long since stripped of glass. She hesitated at the entrance, suddenly uncertain whether she had made a terrible mistake, walking alone to meet a man she barely knew on the word of an unsigned letter. Then she saw him, standing near the empty altar, his dark clothing making him almost invisible in the shadows of the ruined building, and something in her chest loosened slightly, a tension she had not fully realized she was carrying. "You came," Alden said, as she stepped through the doorway. "You did not give me much choice," Alira said. "A letter with no name attached, asking me to meet a stranger in an abandoned chapel. If I had any sense, I would have burned it and stayed home." "And yet here you are," he said, and there was the faintest suggestion of amusement in his voice, though his expression remained as carefully composed as it had been at the dinner table. "Here I am," Alira agreed. "Now perhaps you can explain yourself properly, who you are, what you want, and why the Duke concerns himself with the arrangements my aunt has made for my future." Alden was quiet for a long moment, studying her the way he had studied the chipped plate, as though trying to determine the best way to approach a delicate problem. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost some of its careful distance. "My family has known Edmund Prescott for many years," he said, "longer than I have been alive. My father did business with him once, early in his career, before he understood what kind of man he was dealing with. It did not end well for my father, or for the family that ended up in Prescott's debt because of it." "What family?" Alira asked. "That is not important right now," Alden said, though something in the way he said it told her it was important, perhaps more important than he was willing to admit yet. "What matters is that I have spent the last several years watching Prescott build a pattern. He finds families in difficulty, families with debts they cannot easily repay, and he offers them a solution. Usually it involves a marriage. Usually the woman involved has no real understanding of what she is agreeing to, until it is far too late to change course." Alira felt the cold return to her chest, the same feeling she had carried since first reading the contract. "And my aunt?" "Your aunt owes him a great deal of money," Alden said. "More than she has ever told you, I would guess. The contract you found is not simply about your future. It is about erasing a debt that has been growing for years, one your aunt has been very careful to keep hidden from everyone, including you." "How do you know all of this?" Alira asked. "About my aunt's debts, about the contract, about things I only just discovered myself." Alden hesitated again, and this time the hesitation lasted long enough that Alira began to suspect the answer was something he had been avoiding since the moment they met. "Because I have people who watch Prescott's dealings closely," he said finally. "It is how I learned of the arrangement with your aunt before it was finalized. It is how I knew to attend that dinner, though I was never truly invited as a guest in the way the others were. Your aunt believes I came because your host owed me a courtesy. In truth, I came because I needed to see for myself whether the situation was as urgent as my sources suggested." "And is it?" Alira asked, though she already knew the answer. "It is worse," Alden said quietly. "Prescott has already transferred the first payment to your aunt, which means he considers the arrangement binding, whether or not you have signed anything yourself. Men like him do not simply walk away from an investment. If your aunt tries to back out now, or if you refuse the marriage when it comes time, he will not respond well." Alira sank down onto one of the old wooden pews, the weight of everything he had told her settling over her like a physical thing. She had known, since the moment she found that contract, that her future had been decided without her, but she had not understood the full scope of what that meant, the danger that came wrapped inside the arrangement, hidden beneath the polite language of business and debt. "Why does any of this matter to you?" she asked, looking up at him. You said your family suffered because of Prescott once, years ago, but that does not explain why you would risk anything to help a girl you only met a few days ago." Alden was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally answered, his voice had changed again, quieter, more careful, as though he were choosing each word with particular caution. "Because I have watched this pattern play out before, and I was not able to stop it the first time," he said. "There was a woman, several years ago, in circumstances not unlike yours. I learned of her situation too late. By the time I understood what Prescott intended, the arrangement had already been finalized, and there was nothing I could do to change what happened to her." "What happened to her?" Alira asked, though something in his expression told her she already knew the answer would not be a happy one. "She is no longer able to speak for herself," Alden said, and the flatness in his voice carried more weight than any elaboration could have. "I will not tell you more than that. It is not my story to tell, and I have already said more than I intended." Alira did not press further. She understood, in the way one understands things without needing them fully explained, that whatever had happened to that woman had shaped everything about the man standing in front of her: the careful distance he kept, the precision with which he chose his words, the way he had noticed a crack in a dinner plate before anyone else in the room had thought to look for flaws at all. "So what do you propose?" she asked instead. "You have told me my aunt is in debt, that Prescott will not simply let this arrangement fall apart, and that refusing him carries real danger. But you have not told me what I am supposed to do about any of it." Alden moved closer, sitting on the pew across from her, close enough that she could see the careful control in his expression begin to slip, just slightly, revealing something underneath that looked almost like desperation. "I propose that you let me help you," he said. "I have resources your aunt does not have. I can settle her debt to Prescott directly, in a way that removes his claim on the arrangement entirely. But it would require your trust, and it would require you to do exactly as I ask, even when it does not make immediate sense to you." "That sounds very much like trading one arrangement for another," Alira said carefully. "My aunt sells my future to Prescott, or I trust a stranger I have known for less than a week to save me from it. Forgive me if I find neither option particularly comforting." Something flickered across Alden's face at that, not offense, but a kind of grim understanding, as though he had expected exactly this response and respected her more for giving it. "You are right to be cautious," he said. "I would think less of you if you were not, but I am not asking you to marry me or to sign anything binding your future to mine. I am asking you to let me pay off a debt on your aunt's behalf quietly, in a way that removes Prescott's leverage entirely. What you choose to do with your life after that is entirely your own decision." "And why would you do that?" Alira asked. "For no return of any kind." "Because the last time I had the chance to stop something like this from happening, I failed," Alden said, and this time his voice did not waver, though something in his eyes suggested the words cost him more than they appeared to. "I do not intend to fail again, not when I have the means to prevent it." Alira studied him for a long moment, weighing everything he had told her against everything she had learned in 6 years of living with her aunt. 6 years of understanding that people rarely did anything without wanting something in return. But there was something in the steadiness of his gaze, in the careful way he had approached every part of this conversation, that made her believe, cautiously, that perhaps this was one of the rare exceptions. "If I agree to this," she said slowly, "what happens next?" "I will arrange to meet privately with Prescott and settle the debt he believes your aunt owes him," Alden said. "It will need to be done carefully, in a way that does not immediately reveal my involvement, or he may simply raise the price rather than accept the resolution. In the meantime, you must continue behaving exactly as you have been, giving your aunt no reason to suspect anything has changed. Can you do that?" Alira thought of the years she had spent doing exactly that, smiling when she wanted to scream, staying quiet when she wanted to argue, learning the particular art of appearing calm while everything underneath churned with fear and frustration. "I have had a great deal of practice," she said. Something that might have been the beginning of a smile crossed Alden's face, quickly suppressed but not quickly enough to hide entirely. "Then we understand each other," he said. They talked a while longer, working out the details of how she might send word to him if her aunt grew suspicious, how she might recognize a signal from him if the situation with Prescott changed in a way that required her to act quickly. By the time Alira finally rose to leave, the light outside had begun to shift toward evening, and she knew she needed to hurry if she hoped to reach home before her aunt's patience ran out. At the door of the chapel, she paused and looked back at him. "You still have not told me why you truly came to that dinner," she said. "You said your sources warned you, but a man in your position could have simply sent someone else to investigate. Why come yourself?" Alden's expression grew unreadable again, the careful mask sliding back into place. "Perhaps I wanted to see for myself whether the girl at the center of all this was worth the risk," he said. "Or perhaps I am simply drawn to broken things that no one else has bothered to notice." It was not a complete answer, and Alira suspected he knew it, but she did not push further. She had learned enough for one day, and the walk home would not wait for her to solve every mystery surrounding the strange, careful man who had appeared in her life at the exact moment she needed him most. She hurried back along the narrow roads as the sky darkened around her, her mind full of everything she had learned: the debt, the danger, the woman Alden had mentioned and refused to name, the plan they had built together in the shadow of an abandoned altar. She reached the house just as the last light was fading from the sky, and found her aunt waiting in the front hall, arms crossed, expression sharp with suspicion. "You were gone longer than I expected," Margaret said. "The walk did me good," Alira replied, keeping her voice as steady and unremarkable as she could manage. "I feel much better now." Margaret studied her for a long moment, and Alira held perfectly still under that scrutiny, remembering everything Alden had told her about the importance of behaving exactly as she always had. Whatever her aunt saw in her face, it seemed to satisfy her, at least for the moment, and she turned and walked back toward the kitchen without further comment. Alira climbed the stairs to her room and closed the door behind her, finally allowing herself to exhale the breath she had been holding since she left the chapel. For the first time since she had found that contract in the locked drawer, she felt something other than fear settling into her chest. It was not quite hope, not yet, not with so much still uncertain and so much still at risk. But it was something close to it, a small, fragile possibility that her future might not be as fixed and as terrible as she had believed only a few days earlier. She did not know yet how much would go wrong before it went right, or how close the plan she and Alden had built together would come to falling apart entirely. She only knew that for the first time in 6 years, someone in her life had asked what she wanted, rather than simply telling her what she would do, and that alone was enough to carry her through the uncertain days that she now understood were still ahead of her. For the next week, Alira lived 2 lives at once. In the house, she was the same quiet, obedient niece she had always been, mending clothes, balancing accounts, answering her aunt's questions with the same careful, unremarkable tone she had used for years. But underneath that surface, her mind was constantly turning over everything Alden had told her, watching for any sign that the plan they had built together in the ruined chapel was moving forward or falling apart. The sign came sooner than she expected, though not in the way she had hoped. It began with a change in her aunt's behavior. Margaret grew sharper, more watchful, snapping at small mistakes that would ordinarily have passed without comment. She spent long hours locked in the study, and twice Alira heard raised voices through the door, though she could never make out the words clearly enough to understand what was being discussed. On the 3rd day, a letter arrived for Margaret, delivered by a messenger Alira did not recognize, and her aunt's face went pale as she read it. Pale in a way Alira had never seen before, not even in the worst of their arguments over the years. That evening, Margaret called Elira into the study, and the moment she stepped through the door, she knew something had changed. "Sit down," Margaret said, her voice tight with something that sounded almost like panic beneath its usual sharpness. Elira sat, folding her hands in her lap, keeping her expression as blank as she could manage while her heart pounded against her ribs. "Edmund Prescott believes someone has been interfering in our arrangement," Margaret said, watching her niece's face carefully as she spoke. "He received a visit recently from a man claiming interest in settling debts on my behalf, without my knowledge or consent. He wants to know if I have any idea who might have done such a thing." Elira kept her breathing steady, though every part of her wanted to react, wanted to give away the flicker of hope that rose in her chest at the news that Alden's plan had already reached Prescott, sooner than either of them had expected. "I have no idea," she said carefully. "Why would you ask me?" "Because you have been behaving strangely for weeks," Margaret said, rising from her chair and crossing the room toward her. "Ever since that dinner, ever since you disappeared into that corridor with the Duke of Camborne and came back with a look on your face I did not recognize." Elira's stomach dropped, but she forced herself to hold her aunt's gaze, refusing to let the fear show. "We spoke about porcelain," she said. "Nothing more. You were there when he explained it to the whole table." Margaret studied her for a long, uncomfortable moment, close enough now that Elira could see the fine lines of worry etched into her aunt's face, lines that had not been there a week ago. "If I discover that you have had any part in interfering with this arrangement," Margaret said quietly, "you will regret it far more than you can currently imagine. Prescott is not a patient man. He does not respond well to feeling as though he has been made a fool of." "I have done nothing," Elira said, and for once the lie came easily, smoothed over by 6 years of practice at hiding exactly what she felt. Margaret did not look entirely convinced, but she had no proof, and after a long moment she waved Elira away, returning to her desk and the papers scattered across it. Elira left the study as calmly as she could manage, but the moment she was alone in the hallway, her hands began to shake, adrenaline and fear finally breaking through the careful composure she had held together in front of her aunt. She needed to reach Alden. She needed to know exactly what had happened, whether his approach to Prescott had gone as planned or whether something had gone terribly wrong. But she had no way to contact him directly, only the arrangement they had made in the chapel. A signal she was meant to send if the situation grew urgent enough to require it. That night, once the house had fallen silent and she was certain her aunt was asleep, Elira slipped down to the kitchen and found Corwin still awake, sitting by the last embers of the fire, a habit of his she had noticed many times before but never fully understood. "I need your help," she said quietly, and explained as briefly as she dared that she needed a message carried to a particular address on the eastern edge of the village, the address Alden had given her in case of emergency. Corwin listened without interrupting, his weathered face giving nothing away, and when she finished, he simply nodded. "I will see it done before morning," he said. "But you should know, your aunt has been asking me questions too, about your movements, about where you go when you say you need air." "What did you tell her?" Elira asked. "I told her nothing," Corwin said. "I have worked in this house long enough to know when silence serves better than honesty, but she is not a foolish woman. She will find her own answers eventually, whether or not I give them to her." Elira thanked him and returned to her room, though sleep did not come easily that night. She lay awake listening to every creak of the old house, every gust of wind against the windows, half expecting her aunt to burst through the door at any moment with proof of exactly what Elira had done. The reply from Alden came the following evening, carried again through Corwin's careful discretion, folded small enough to hide easily in a sleeve or a pocket. It was short, and its brevity did nothing to ease the tension coiled in her chest. "Prescott suspects interference but has not yet connected it to me directly. The debt negotiation has stalled. He is demanding proof that your aunt did not orchestrate this herself, and until he receives it, he will not release his claim on the arrangement. This has become more dangerous than I anticipated. Do not leave the house alone until I send further word." Alira read the letter 3 times before burning it in the small fire in her room, the same way she had burned the first, watching the paper curl and blacken until nothing remained but ash. Do not leave the house alone. The instruction sat heavy in her chest, a reminder of exactly how precarious her position had become, caught between an aunt who suspected her of something she could not prove and a merchant who suspected everyone of interfering with a deal he considered already settled. 3 more days passed in a tense, watchful quiet. Margaret's questions grew sharper, more pointed, though she never quite crossed the line into open accusation. Alira kept to the house as instructed, finding small tasks to occupy her hands and her mind, though her thoughts never strayed far from the danger circling closer with each passing hour. It was on the 4th day that everything changed. Alira was in the kitchen, helping Corwin prepare the evening meal, when the sound of a carriage arriving at the front of the house pulled her attention away from the vegetables she had been chopping. She moved to the window and watched as a finely dressed figure stepped down from the carriage, and her blood ran cold the moment she recognized Edmund Prescott's face beneath the brim of his hat. He had never come to the house before. All previous dealings had happened through letters, through arrangements made at dinners and social gatherings, never with Prescott himself standing at the front door of the house where Alira lived. His presence now, unannounced, could only mean that something had gone very wrong. She heard her aunt's footsteps hurrying toward the front hall, heard the door open, heard the low murmur of voices exchanging greetings that sounded far too formal for the tension Alira could feel radiating even through the walls. She moved as close to the kitchen door as she dared, straining to catch fragments of the conversation drifting from the front hall. "Unexpected complications," Prescott was saying, his voice carrying the same smooth, controlled tone she remembered from the dinner, though now edged with something colder. "I trust you understand my concern. A significant sum has already changed hands, and now I find someone attempting to interfere with an arrangement I considered settled." "I assure you, I have no knowledge of any interference," Margaret said, her voice pitched carefully to hide the tremor Alira knew was there, the same tremor she had heard in the study days earlier. "Then perhaps your niece does," Prescott said, and Alira's heart stopped entirely at the sound of her own name spoken so directly in her aunt's front hall. "I understand she was seen speaking privately with the Duke of Camborne at the dinner, where our arrangement was meant to be finalized. It seems an unusual coincidence that a man of his standing would take such a sudden interest in a girl he had never met before, at exactly the moment my claim on her future is being questioned." "The Duke is known for his eccentric interests," Margaret said quickly, though Alira could hear the panic creeping into her voice now. "It means nothing." "Perhaps," Prescott said, "or perhaps I should speak with her myself and hear her account of that conversation directly." Alira did not wait to hear her aunt's response. She moved quickly and quietly back to the far side of the kitchen, her mind racing through every instruction Alden had given her, every warning about behaving as she always had, about giving nothing away. But nothing he had told her had prepared her for the possibility of Prescott himself standing in the front hall, demanding to speak with her directly, close enough that any misstep in her expression or her voice might unravel everything they had worked to build. Corwin appeared at her side, his weathered hand resting briefly on her shoulder, a small gesture of steadiness in the middle of the fear churning through her chest. "Whatever happens," he said quietly, "you have survived worse in this house than one difficult conversation. Remember that." Alira nodded, though she was not entirely certain she believed him. She smoothed her apron, steadied her breathing as best she could, and walked out to meet whatever was waiting for her in the front hall, knowing that the careful balance she and Alden had built over the past weeks was about to be tested in a way neither of them had fully anticipated. Margaret's face, when Alira entered the hall, was a careful mask of composure stretched thin over something close to desperation. Prescott stood near the door, his hat still in his hands, his eyes moving over Alira with the same assessing look he had given her at the dinner weeks earlier, though now there was something sharper in it, something searching for cracks. "Miss Whitmore," he said, his voice smooth and pleasant in a way that did nothing to ease the tension in the room. "I hope you will forgive the unannounced visit. I find myself in need of some clarification regarding a conversation you had recently with a mutual acquaintance of ours." "I am not certain what you mean," Alira said, keeping her voice as steady and unremarkable as she could manage, though every instinct in her body was screaming at her to run. "The Duke of Camborne," Prescott said. "You spoke with him privately during the dinner at which our arrangement was meant to be settled. I would very much like to know what was discussed." Alira felt her aunt's eyes on her, sharp and watchful, waiting to see whether her niece's story would match whatever Margaret had already told him. She thought quickly, drawing on the same instincts that had kept her safe through 6 years of careful, guarded living in this house. "He commented on a flaw in the dinnerware," she said. "I found it an odd thing to discuss at such a formal occasion, but he seemed quite taken with the subject. I do not recall much else. I am afraid I did not find the conversation particularly memorable." Prescott studied her for a long moment, and Alira held perfectly still under his gaze, refusing to let her expression waver, refusing to give him anything more than the flat, unremarkable answer she had prepared. Whatever he was searching for in her face, he did not seem to find it, though the suspicion in his eyes did not fully disappear either. "How curious," he said finally, "that a man of his standing would travel such a distance for a dinner he was not truly invited to, simply to discuss the flaws in a dinner plate." "I could not say what motivated his attendance," Alira said. "I only know what he discussed with me." Prescott's gaze lingered on her for another moment before shifting back to Margaret, and Alira allowed herself the smallest breath of relief, though she knew the danger had not fully passed. Whatever answers he had come seeking, he had not found enough proof to act on his suspicions directly, not yet. But the way he studied both of them before finally excusing himself, promising to return once his own inquiries into the Duke's involvement were complete, told Alira that this was far from over. As his carriage pulled away from the house, Margaret turned to her niece with an expression Alira had never seen before, something caught between fury and fear. And for the first time in 6 years, her aunt's carefully maintained composure cracked entirely. "What have you done?" Margaret whispered. Alira met her aunt's eyes and for the first time in her life did not look away first. "I found out the truth," she said quietly, "about the contract, about the debt, about exactly what you were willing to sell to solve your own problems." Margaret's face went through several emotions in quick succession: shock, anger, something that might have been shame quickly buried beneath the anger that followed it. "You do not understand what you have interfered with," she said. "Prescott does not forgive being made a fool of. If he discovers the Duke's true involvement, there will be consequences for all of us, not just for you." "Then perhaps you should have told me the truth from the beginning," Alira said, "instead of trying to sell my future without a single word of explanation." Margaret opened her mouth to respond, but no words came, and after a long, tense silence, she turned and walked back toward the study, leaving Alira standing alone in the front hall, her heart still pounding from the confrontation, uncertain whether she had just protected the plan she and Alden had built together, or brought it one step closer to collapse. She did not know, standing there in the fading light of that evening, that Edmund Prescott had already begun making inquiries of his own, quiet and thorough, that would soon lead him directly to the truth he had been searching for. She only knew that the careful balance of secrecy she had maintained for weeks was growing thinner by the day, and that whatever came next would decide, once and for all, whether her future belonged to her aunt's debts, to Prescott's cruelty, or to the fragile hope a stranger in an abandoned chapel had offered her. Word from Alden arrived 2 days later, carried once again through Corwin's careful hands, though this time the message was longer, more urgent, written in handwriting that seemed less controlled than the notes she had received before. Prescott has traced my involvement. He knows I attempted to settle your aunt's debt, and he has concluded, correctly, that my interest in the arrangement extends beyond simple curiosity. He intends to finalize the marriage contract immediately, before I have the opportunity to intervene further. I believe he means to move the ceremony forward within the week. You must be ready to leave the house the moment I send word. Trust no arrangement your aunt proposes between now and then, no matter how reasonable it may sound. Alira read the letter twice, her hands trembling with a mixture of fear and something close to fury. 6 years of careful obedience, and still her future was being decided by men who spoke of her as though she were a piece of property to be moved and traded according to their own timelines. She burned the letter as she had burned the others, but this time the fire did little to calm the storm building inside her chest. Her aunt confirmed the news that same evening, though she framed it very differently than Alden had. Prescott has agreed to move the wedding forward, Margaret said, her voice carrying a forced brightness that did nothing to hide the fear underneath it. He believes there is no reason to delay any longer, given the circumstances. The ceremony will take place in 5 days. You mean he wants to secure the arrangement before the Duke can interfere further, Alira said flatly. Margaret's expression flickered, surprise quickly replaced by something colder. You know more about this than you have admitted, she said. I want the truth, Alira, now, before this goes any further. Alira considered lying again, considered continuing the careful game she had played for weeks, but something in her had changed since Prescott's visit, some final thread of patience finally worn through by years of secrets and silence. The truth, she said, is that I know exactly what you sold me for, and exactly what kind of man you sold me to. The truth is that a stranger showed more concern for my future in a single conversation than you have shown in 6 years of raising me. Margaret's face went pale, then flushed with anger, and for a moment Alira thought her aunt might strike her, something that had never quite happened before despite years of harsh words and colder treatment. But Margaret only stood there, fists clenched at her sides, breathing hard before finally turning away. You do not understand the position I was in, Margaret said, her voice quieter now, stripped of its usual sharpness. The debts I inherited when your parents died were not small. I did what I believed necessary to keep this household running, to keep a roof over both our heads. You could have told me, Alira said. You could have trusted me with the truth instead of a contract hidden in a locked drawer. Margaret did not answer that. She simply walked away, leaving Alira alone in the hallway once more, the weight of the coming days pressing down on her chest like something physical. The next 4 days passed in a haze of careful preparation and constant, quiet fear. Alira packed a small bag of essentials, hidden beneath the loose floorboard in her room where she had once hidden nothing more than a few treasured letters from her parents. She watched the road from her window each evening, waiting for some sign, some signal, that Alden's plan had finally reached its final stage. On the 4th night, the sign came in the form of Corwin knocking softly on her door well past midnight, his face lit only by the small candle he carried. A carriage is waiting at the end of the lane, he whispered. The driver says he was sent by a man with silver buttons on his coat, and that you would understand what that meant. Alira's heart leapt. Alden had mentioned, in one of their earlier conversations in the chapel, that any carriage he sent would be marked by a driver wearing silver buttons, a small detail meant to confirm the message truly came from him, and not from Prescott attempting some trick of his own. She gathered her bag from beneath the floorboard, her hands shaking with equal parts fear and relief, and followed Corwin down the back stairs, through the kitchen, and out into the cold night air. The old butler walked her to the edge of the property, glancing back toward the dark windows of the house with obvious tension. "Your aunt sleeps heavily this time of night," he said. "You should have time before she notices you are gone, but you must hurry." "Thank you," Elira said, throat tight with emotion she did not have time to fully express. "For everything. For all the kindness you never had to show me." Corwin's weathered face softened just slightly. "Go," he said, "before I lose my courage and insist you stay for tea first." Elira almost laughed despite everything, a small, startled sound in the darkness, before turning and hurrying down the lane toward the waiting carriage. The driver, true to Corwin's description, wore a coat fastened with small silver buttons that caught what little moonlight filtered through the clouds overhead. He helped her into the carriage without a word, and moments later they were moving swiftly down the dark road, away from the only home she had known for 6 years. The journey felt endless, every creak of the wheels and every shift of the carriage sending fresh spikes of fear through her chest, certain at any moment that Prescott's men might appear on the road ahead, or that her aunt might wake and raise an alarm that would reach them before they arrived wherever they were going. But the road remained empty, the night remained quiet, and eventually the carriage began to slow as it approached a large house set back from the road, its windows glowing warm and gold against the darkness. Alden was waiting at the door when the carriage finally stopped, and the relief on his face when he saw her step down safely was so immediate and so unguarded that it startled her, a rare crack in the careful composure he had maintained since the moment they met. "You are safe," he said, and it was not quite a question. "I am safe," Elira confirmed, though her voice shook slightly with the aftermath of the fear she had carried the entire journey. "What happens now?" "Now," Alden said, leading her inside where a fire burned warm in a large hearth, "we finish what we started. Prescott believes he still holds the leverage he needs. That your aunt's debt still binds you to the arrangement. He does not yet know that the debt itself no longer exists." Elira's eyes widened. "You settled it." "2 days ago," Alden confirmed. "Quietly, through intermediaries who have no connection to me that Prescott can trace easily. Your aunt's debt to him has been paid in full. The contract binding you to the marriage has no foundation left to stand on. Prescott simply does not know this yet, which is precisely why we needed to move you somewhere safe before he learns the truth and decides to act rashly out of anger rather than reason." "He came to the house," Elira said. "He suspected you already." "He suspected involvement," Alden said. "He did not yet know the debt itself had been resolved. That distinction matters a great deal to a man like Prescott. Suspicion he can work around. Confirmed loss of leverage he cannot." They sat together by the fire for a long while, and Elira found herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, simply breathing without the constant weight of fear pressing against her chest. She told him about the confrontation in the front hall, about her aunt's fury and her own refusal to look away, and Alden listened with the same careful attention he gave everything, occasionally asking a quiet question, but mostly simply letting her speak. "What happens to my aunt now?" Elira finally asked. "Will there be consequences for her once Prescott learns the debt no longer exists?" Alden considered the question carefully before answering. "That depends a great deal on your aunt's own choices in the days ahead. Prescott will be furious, certainly, but a man in his position generally prefers to avoid the kind of public scandal that would come from openly punishing a woman for a debt he has already been paid in full. My guess is he will simply withdraw from the arrangement quietly, unwilling to draw further attention to a deal that no longer serves his interests." "And me," Elira asked, "what happens to me now?" Alden was quiet for a long moment, watching the fire rather than her face, as though the answer required more careful consideration than anything else they had discussed that night. "That," he said finally, "is entirely your decision. I did not do any of this expecting something in return. You are free now, free of the debt, free of the contract, free of the arrangement your aunt made without your knowledge or consent. Whatever you choose to do with that freedom is yours alone to decide." Elira studied him for a long moment, the fire casting warm light across the careful, guarded lines of his face, and thought of everything he had risked to bring her to this point. The resources spent, the danger courted, the story of the woman he had failed to save years earlier that had clearly shaped every careful choice he made since. "You never finished telling me about her," she said quietly. "The woman you mentioned in the chapel." Something shifted in Alden's expression, old grief surfacing briefly before he pushed it back down with the same careful control he brought to everything. "Her name was Grace," he said. "She was meant to marry into my family, a match arranged between our families when we were both quite young. Prescott found a way to insert himself into the negotiations, offering to settle debts my family owed at the time, in exchange for influence over the marriage terms. By the time I understood what he truly wanted, it was too late to stop the arrangement from finalizing. Grace was never the same afterward. She lives now in the countryside, cared for by people who love her, but the woman I once knew as a friend disappeared somewhere in the middle of that arrangement, and she has never fully returned." Alira reached out without fully deciding to and rested her hand briefly over his. "That was not your failure," she said. "You were young. You did not have the power then that you have now." "Perhaps," Alden said, though the doubt in his voice suggested he had not fully forgiven himself for it. "Not yet, and perhaps never would. But I have spent every year since making certain I would never again stand by while someone else's future was decided for them, not while I had any power to prevent it." They sat together in silence for a while after that, the fire slowly burning lower, the weight of everything they had both survived settling gently between them rather than pulling them apart. Outside, the night stretched on toward morning, and somewhere far behind them, Alira knew, her aunt would soon wake to find the house empty of everything but the truth she had spent so long trying to hide. The following weeks brought exactly the resolution Alden had predicted. Prescott, upon learning the debt had already been resolved through channels he could not easily trace, withdrew from the arrangement quietly, unwilling to risk further embarrassment over a deal that no longer held any value for him. Margaret, stripped of the leverage she had once held over her niece's future, retreated into a smaller, quieter version of the life she had once controlled so completely. Though whatever regret or reflection came with that change, she never fully shared with Alira again. Alira did not return to her aunt's house. Alden offered her a place within his own household, not as any kind of obligation, but as an open door she was free to walk through or leave closed, exactly as she chose. She took her time deciding, spending the first weeks of her freedom simply learning what it felt like to make choices about her own days without fear of what punishment might follow. Slowly, carefully, something grew between her and the quiet, careful Duke who had first noticed her by noticing a flaw in a dinner plate no one else had bothered to see. It was not the sweeping, sudden romance of stories told at village gatherings. It was slower than that, built on trust earned one careful conversation at a time, on the steady understanding that neither of them owed the other anything beyond what they freely chose to give. Months later, standing in the garden of the house that had become her home, Alira thought back often to the night she had first opened that locked drawer, the fear that had gripped her upon reading her own name attached to a number she never chose. She thought of her aunt, of the years of careful obedience that had shaped her into someone capable of surviving that discovery without breaking entirely. And she thought of the strange, quiet Duke who had walked into a dinner, meant to seal her fate, and had instead spent every resource at his disposal to give her back the one thing her aunt had tried to sell without her knowledge. Her future, finally, belonged entirely to her. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, that thought did not frighten her at all.